The next session in this panel on women in antiquity is by Hilary Ilkay, and Hilary is a fellow in the humanities at Halifax, and she has worked on a wide variety of topics, both in classics from Euripides and then all the way to early modern philosophy and early modern authors. So today specifically, she's going to tell us about Diotima, and her talk is titled Diotima's Renaissance, Rediscovery, Reception and Rewriting, which sounds wonderful. So Hilary, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you all for coming to this shared Zoom space. And I apologize, I have two very rambunctious cats this morning who are running around. They've just channeled their most demonic energy right now. So I apologize if they're screaming and running in and out of frame. It's just the joys of presenting from home and teaching from home. So they'll just be there, hopefully, in the background. Okay, so the corpus of Platonic dialogues features a multitude of characters, but only two are women. Notably, both are foreigners to Athens, and neither is physically present in the texts in which they appear. In the Menexenus, which is a lesser known work by Plato, I would say, Socrates quotes a speech composed by the rhetorician Aspasia, a medic from Miletus, who was a companion to the great statesman Pericles and suffered many attacks for her private and public life. She was a figure of infamy, I would say, in Athens. And her reception has also been very interesting, though I won't talk about that here today. The other woman is perhaps the more alluring and more mysterious Diotima of Mantinea. Socrates recounts a lengthy conversation with her in his dialogue on love, the Symposium, in lieu of giving his own speech on the subject. When he's asked to provide his account, he says, "Let me tell you about my conversation with Diotima." According to Socrates' account, Diotima is wise in these matters of erotics, as he says, and many other subjects as well, and served as his teacher in this regard. She even uses the sort of Socratic method that he employs in his dialogues. He credits her with delaying the plague in Athens by 10 years through her sacrifices, suggesting without explicitly saying that she has prophetic ritual powers in the city. So when introducing her, he also calls her Hexene, the foreigner, establishing her separateness in every way from the all-male Athenian setting and guest list of the drinking party that's taking place. So these are the only biographical details of Diotima we have. I'm so sorry, he's having a hallucination right now. These are the only biographical details of Diotima we have available to us. And the only evidence of her philosophical wisdom is mediated through the narrating voice of Socrates, which is in turn mediated through the authorial voice of Plato, who's writing the dialogue. So while Aspasia is accepted as a historical figure, Diotima is not. The predominant scholarly interpretation is that she is a fiction, a claim that has been justified in three major ways, I would say. So the first is philological, hinging mostly on a sense of wordplay in Diotima's name and her homeland. Because Diotima translates, you could say, as honor of Zeus, and Mantinea seems to evoke the Greek adjective mantike, which means oracular, or something about her name that suggests that she's an invented character. The second is historical or archaeological. There's no extant evidence of Diotima before Plato's dialogue, and no mention of her in connection with the Athenian plague. And the scant archaeological remains that have depictions of her cannot attest to her independent existence. The third is philosophical or literary. So despite some overlaps, Diotima's theories that she presents in the symposium about the forms, immortality, eros itself, and reason depart from those presented elsewhere in the Platonic corpus. And scholars say that it's rare for a woman to play such a central role in a male-dominated world, that is the dialogues. So as a result, her role in the symposium has been presented in a few different ways, as Plato's so-called feminization of philosophy, or even appropriation of the feminine, as a demonstration of his literary skill, right? That he's a great writer and writer of invention, or as an example of his ironic wit, right? Socrates is just very funny. In the logic of the latter two arguments, Plato constructs Diotima either to show the dominance of his own philosophical discourse or to symbolize the earlier stages of Socrates' philosophical thought. So the logic here is that Diotima serves as an important and interesting construct in the dialogue. A small number of scholars have sought to prove that she was in fact historical. And while I'm personally not sure this is the most productive approach either, since we can't lay claim to any certainty in this matter, the goal of my research that I'm presenting here today as well is twofold. So the first is to examine the motivations behind assuming that she's invented rather than leaving it an open question. And two, to reflect on her historical reception and what that can tell us not only about the wider reception of Plato, but the reception of the relationship between women and knowledge, of their capacity to be educated and to educate others. There's sort of two questions going on here. One of the scholars invested in arguing for Diotima's historical existence is Mary Ellen Waithe, whose entry on Diotima in volume 1 of her History of Women Philosophers, which was published in 1987, continues to be incredibly influential in scholarly and popular conceptions of Diotima. Waithe poses important challenges to the types of readings I mentioned above that cavalierly dismiss the potential of Diotima as a real person rather than a character in the fictional sense. Everyone's a character in Plato's dialogues, but they think she's a kind of invented character. So going a step further, however, she also tries to provide an originating source of this scholarly conception of Diotima as fiction. And she identifies the 15th century Italian humanist, Marsilio Ficino, as the man responsible in the following passage. So I'm going to quote from Waithe here. For almost 1900 years, from the time Plato wrote the Symposium to 1485, when Marsilio Ficino published his Oratio Septima II, nowhere is the suggestion found that Diotima was anything but a real person who had the conversation with Socrates that is recorded by Plato. Ficino's remark achieved and retained the status of received doctrine for the next 500 years, end quote. So who is this man, Marsilio Ficino, whom Waithe boldly condemns as the misogynist culprit in the story? He was one of the leading actors of the so-called Platonic revival in the Latin West, focused in Italy especially, which was instigated as Greek scholars began to migrate from Byzantium, first for the religious council of Ferrara, Florence between 1438 and 1445, and then more emphatically after the fall of Constantinople in 1453 to the Ottomans. So these scholars brought with them knowledge of ancient Greek, as well as a rich corpus of Greek texts, including the complete dialogues of Plato, which had been lost to the West, serving as tutors to Italian humanists who were keen to make these works accessible to Latin readers. So translations of the Platonic dialogues into Latin began appearing with an unparalleled rapidity across Italy. This effort is epitomized in the ambitious project of our man, Ficino, who published the first complete works of Plato in Latin in 1484, and followed it with a series of extensive annotations and commentaries in 1496. The Symposium was among the dialogues to which he devoted almost a complete commentary. Ficino's astounding accomplishment of large-scale translation and commentary codified the sprawling Platonic corpus for the Latin West, and his exegeses would prove instrumental to Renaissance and early modern interpretations of Plato's works and teachings. Aware of the fraught tension between Platonic philosophy and Christian values, pederasty being one of the most egregious, if we're looking at the Symposium especially, in his commentaries, Ficino adopts a syncretic approach, what scholar James Hankins has called, quote, exegesis as apologetic, which I find a very nice phrase. This is epitomized in his notion of the so-called Platonic theology. So the idea that Plato's philosophy was sent by God to restore and strengthen Christianity. This negates the view that ancient philosophical religion was supplanted by the advent of Christianity. So Ficino's mystically inflected syncretic reading of Plato was highly influential in its time. What motivation then would Ficino have for dismissing Socrates' account of Diotima as his teacher on the grounds that a woman couldn't be a philosopher? In pondering this question over the years, as I have done, I've identified a number of problems with Waite's incendiary claim in her text. So perhaps one of the more obvious problems that I see is that she does not cite the actual passage to which she obliquely alludes. Her source citation is a bit misleading. There's no freestanding Oratio Septima 2 text. Waite seems to be referring here to Ficino's commentary on the Symposium, also called De Amore, on love. And while there is indeed within that text an Oratio Septima and a Caput 2, a chapter 2, no substantial mention of Diotima is made in that particular section. So the only relevant instance of her name is found in its concluding statement, which reads the following, quote, one is able to learn in what way Socrates loved if one remembers the teaching of Diotima, end quote. So the lengthiest discussion of Diotima actually appears in the previous section of his commentary in Oratio Sexta. So in the first chapter, which introduces the discussion about love, Ficino writes as follows, and it's a long passage, so bear with me, but I want to quote it in full because I think it's very interesting. So this is what he says. Our Socrates, who was judged by the oracle of Apollo to be the wisest of all the Greeks, was accustomed to practice the art of loving before other arts, as if it was on account of expertise in this skill in particular, that Socrates or anyone else should be considered the wisest. He claimed that he had learned this profession not from Anaxagoras, Damon, or Archelaus, the natural philosophers, nor from Prodicus, or of Seos, or Aspasia, the professors of rhetoric, nor from the musician Conus, although he had learned much from all of them, but from Diotima, the female prophet, in Latin fatidica muliere, who was inspired by the Holy Spirit, divino afflata spiritu in Latin. These are direct translations from a Latin text that I did. He made this claim, in my opinion, in order to show that it was only by divine inspiration that human beings are able to understand the nature of true beauty and lawful love, as well as in what manner we ought to love. You, chaste Symposias, and all others consecrated to Diana and Pallas, you who exult in the freedom of a pure soul and in the eternal delight of the mind, attend here happily and listen carefully to the divine mysteries revealed to Socrates by Diotima. And that's the end of the quotation. So Ficino identifies Socrates in this passage as a figure of superlative wisdom as deemed by Apollo, on account of his expertise in and practice of the philosophical art of love. He draws a distinction between, on the one hand, the male natural philosophers, the rhetoricians, and the musicians, from whom Socrates learned a number of things, and on the other, the female prophet Diotima, from whom he learned about love. And I want to just dwell for a moment, if you'll indulge me, on this word fatidica that he uses in Latin. This is a rare Latin word, and so it's a deliberate choice for Ficino. If you look in the Lewis and Short dictionary, it appears as fatidicus, an adjectival conjunction of fatum, fate, and dico, to speak. So if something is fatidicus, it is fate speaking, right? Or more colloquially, prophetic. So Ficino uses the feminized form fatidica to modify the Latin word mulier, right? Woman, when describing Diotima. So some other notable uses of this word for context. Ovid uses fatidicus twice in Metamorphoses to describe Themis in book 1, whom Deucalion and Pyrrha worship as the wise goddess of oracles. And then Tiresias in book 3, the blind prophet who foretells Narcissus's demise, right, is described as fatidicus. But the most interesting usage for my purposes comes in book 8 of Virgil's Aeneid to describe the nymph Carmentis, Vatis fatidicae, a prophesying prophet, we might say, who first foretold the future of Aeneas's lineage. And Suetonius also uses it in connection with Sibyls. So very rich history of the use of this word. And Ficino is calling upon that history and using it here. So Diotima is described in syncretic language as being inspired by the divine spirit, right? By this, it kind of breathed in by the Holy Spirit. At the end of the passage, Ficino enjoins those inclined toward heavenly rather than vulgar love to learn her revelations. There's no sentiment on Ficino's part, must be Plato's invention. So if, as Ficino states, Socrates is the wisest due to his knowledge of love, and Diotima was his teacher in this regard, then Diotima's epistemological authority must be of the highest order. Indeed, Ficino explicitly states in the passage that divine inspiration is humanity's only access to the truth about beauty and love. So without Diotima's mediation, therefore, Socrates would not have been able to understand love and be its exemplary practitioner. This is evident in Plato's text itself, as Socrates struggles on many occasions to follow his teacher's line of reasoning. Diotima scolds him, laughs at his ignorance, and even before embarking on her final portion of her speech, questions his ability to reach her final mystical revelation. So elsewhere in his commentary, Ficino aligns Diotima with the ancient prophetic tradition, calling her the Sibyl Diotima. Similarly, in another text, the Platonic Theology, Ficino places Diotima and Socrates in the same category of figures of wisdom, along with Delphic priests, Sibyls, and Hebrew prophets. So that of divinely inspired seers. The Greek figure of the Sibyl, right, later pluralized, was a foreboding oracular force whose prophecies, often delivered in the form of riddles, were treated with the utmost veneration. So Virgil's Cumaean Sibyl is perhaps the most famous literary example. In book 6 of the Aeneid, the poet refers to, quote, the mysteries of the terrifying Sibyl, in whom the Delian prophet inspires great mind and spirit and reveals the future, wrapping truths in obscurities, end quote. One need only think of the proliferation of Sibyl imagery in the Renaissance, seen most strikingly in this on Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, for instance, ceiling, and on the kind of marble floor of the Siena Duomo, to realize the significance of these ancient female pagan figures for the Italian imagination and their syncretic potential for Christian humanists, right? There's something going on with Sibyls in this time. So while the figure of Diotima, along with Socrates, becomes part of Ficino's attempt to reconcile Christian theology and Greek philosophy, she does not lose her historical reality through his commentary, nor does he make any misogynist statements about her or about women as philosophers, as thinkers. So the plot thickens if we turn to a text written just before Ficino's translation project was completed. And that's Basilios Bessarion's Latin translation of his own Greek work, published in 1469, and entitled In Calumniatorem Platonis, or Against a Detractor of Plato. So a stormy dispute concerning the virtues of Plato versus Aristotle was taking place between Bessarion and George Trebizond, just excellent names here, who published a book in 1457 entitled Comparationes Philosophorum Aristotelis et Platonis, or Comparisons of the Philosophers Aristotle and Plato. Scholars who analyze these works, and there aren't too many, which is sad, tend to focus on their differing treatments of sexuality in Plato. But there's an overlooked critical conversation taking place between Trebizond and Bessarion about women's intellectual authority, and more specifically about diatima. Trebizond makes the case that the bulk of Plato's philosophy can be found in his Symposium. Quote, "For in that work, Socrates, intending to determine the nature of love based on the opinion of diatima, a very holy woman, sanctissima in Latin, as he little remark, disclosed all of pagan and Platonic philosophy," end quote. So after describing Aristotle's conception of the divine, Trebizond accuses Plato of stumbling upon, literally descending into, delabitur in Latin, this viewpoint. Quote, "He descends, I say, because he quickly retreats from there, and immersed again in old wives' tales, appears to perceive nothing sublime," end quote. So according to Trebizond, Diatima's teachings about eros, akin to old wives' tales, bear no philosophical veritas, and Plato, espousing them in the Symposium, reveals his gullibility when it comes to the words of women. Trebizond may undermine Diatima's philosophical authority in his account, but he doesn't question her historical reality. In fact, her existence is crucial to his argument about Plato's inferiority, right, that he listened to her. So Bessarion, in an attempt to defend Plato from such detractions, writes the following in his text. Quote, "What Socrates in the dialogue imagines, finget in Latin, that he received from the woman Diatima, my opponent attributes not to Socrates, not to Plato, but to Diatima, and calls them old wives' tales, aniles fabulas. These things belong to Plato, not a woman, but he was inclined to represent it imaginatively in this way. Sed livuit ita fingi," again, fingi, that verb there, "so that what was being said under divine inspiration, divinitas in Latin, appeared to be related by a certain prophet, and as it were a sibyl. Just because it was spoken by a woman does not immediately mean that it is a fable, as my opponent alleges. He takes this as the rationale for his criticism, as if not many learned women existed, and as if not many women, led by the Holy Spirit, predicted the future and gave very opportune advice to men. Indeed, not only should Plato not be reproached, but he should even be praised, since he believed that one could be brought to the knowledge of things divine by the agency of a woman, opera mulieris. Accordingly, whether Plato invents or states truly that he learned of these things from a woman, he does not err, since invention is permitted by the law of dialogue, and it is obvious that women can relate many things under divine inspiration, nor does he recount fables," end quote. So in this passage, Bessarion makes two decisive interpretive moves. First, he affirms that women have been the possessors of knowledge and have related truths through the mode of divine inspiration, rejecting his colleague's misogynist position that women are only capable of producing old wives' tales. Second, he opens up the possibility that Plato invented Diatima as a character in the dialogue. The Latin verb finget here is notably ambiguous, but not in a way I want to suggest that denigrates her or women more broadly. The question of invention is almost irrelevant to Bessarion, for it is part and parcel of the literary dialogue form. Plato is writing scenarios among characters rather than transcribing conversations between people. So this is what Bessarion means when he says these things belong to Plato, not a woman, but he was inclined to represent it imaginatively. They belong to Plato insofar as he's the author of the dialogue, and he must make choices about how to represent his ideas. But for Bessarion, it would be absurd to deny that Socrates could have learned about love from a woman. And he, in fact, praises Plato for advocating that the agency of a woman could lead the mind toward divine knowledge. This is his attempt to redeem what Trebizond calls old wives' tales. By representing Diotima as a prophetic sibyl, just as Ficino does, he establishes that her words bear the highest authority, the divine. There's no misogynist agenda. It is more of a reflection on the role of the imagination in the dialogue form itself. What these two texts bring out is that what I like to call the Diotima debate was happening as part of a larger conversation about the philosophical reputation of the two heavyweights of ancient Greek philosophy before Ficino published his commentaries, which brings to light another inconsistency in Waith's claim. So Ficino himself was all too aware of this heated debate. In fact, John Monfessani, who writes brilliantly about this time period, reveals that Bessarion sent a copy of his text to Ficino. There had already been an epistolary correspondence between the two Platonists. So when Bessarion sent his defense, however, Ficino was keen to stay out of the Plato versus Aristotle dispute, which eventually ended with the deaths of Bessarion and Trebizond. So Monfessani writes, quote, "In his response, despite his desire to please and their common devotion to Plato, Ficino studiously avoided attacking Trebizond or any other Aristotelian. He was just not going to be dragged into the Plato-Aristotle controversy started by the Greeks," end quote. So indeed, the letter Ficino sent back to Bessarion hardly discusses In Calumniatorem Platonis. It celebrates the arrival of an age in which Plato would be properly understood and the original effulgence of his teachings, darkened by the ignorant minds of men, restored. Quote, "Let the spirit of Plato and us, all of his followers, rejoice in this to the utmost," end quote. So perhaps Ficino was slyly referring to his own future accomplishments rather than to Bessarion's offering. His commentary on Diotima, though, aligns with Bessarion's estimation of her knowledge as prophetic and sibylline, right? But I think he's even more generous to her in his text. The possibility Bessarion presents of Diotima's fictional nature is not discussed in Ficino, whose project is not directly concerned with defending an image of Plato, right? It's a different kind of project. So Waith's version of the narrative, therefore, assigns blame to the wrong person. Perhaps this points to the problem that it is misguided to try to identify a single culprit in the engendering of Diotima as fictional, because the issue is far more nuanced. It may be convenient from the perspective of feminist criticism to hold one man accountable for inaugurating a misogynist position, but it's not historically accurate. So absolved of Waith's accusation, Ficino can now be read as a figure responsible for restoring Diotima to the cultural and intellectual imagination of the West, as the enlightened woman who instructed Socrates, and for treating her role in the symposium independently of any biased project of attacking or defending Plato as a philosopher. The last part of Waith's claim about the 500-year legacy of Ficino's so-called sexist remark becoming received doctrine is also called into question when one examines the explosion of references to Diotima in the wake of Ficino's translations and commentaries. So while Waith is right to emphasize Ficino's influence, she does not account for the fact that he actually helped usher in what I call Diotima's renaissance, among not just men, but women of the time as well. So Diotima became a potent exemplar of ancient wisdom in her own right, and due to her intellectual relationship with the divine Socrates, as he was known. So this is by way of conclusion. We should also keep in mind that along with Symposium, avid readers of Plato's dialogues would have received his Republic in translation. So in book 5, when discussing the role of women in the ideal city, the Callipolis, Socrates says, quote, There is no way of life concerned with the management of the city that belongs to a woman because she's a woman, or to a man because he's a man, but the various natures in both creatures. Women share by nature in every way of life, just as men do. So the implication of this is that women have diverse abilities and interests just like men. So one will be better suited to being a doctor, another a musician, and another one an athlete. Socrates then asked the following question. Further, isn't one woman philosophical or a lover of wisdom while another hates wisdom? So with this question, he opens up philosophy, right? The activity of loving wisdom to both men and women. Philosophy is not gendered, nor is the intellect's capacity to be a philosopher. So taken together with the presence of Diotima as a figure of intellectual authority in Symposium, Plato's representations of women inspired Italian humanists to think about the roles and capabilities of women in their own time. So I won't go into in-depth examples here, but we can find rich allusions to Diotima in dialogues inspired by Symposium, like dialogue on the infinity of love from 1577 by the honest courtesan Tullia d'Aragona, who accuses her central interlocutor Varchi of not acting enough like Socrates because he tries to impart lessons rather than learn from his teacher, Diotima, namely herself. And L'amorosa Filosofia, also a little bit later, by the humanist Francesco Patrizzi, who calls the subject of the text, the virtuosa Tarquinia Mulsa, nuova Diotima, a new Diotima. I'm really interested in this phrase. Who composed poetry, quote, from the philosophical foundations formed in her mind in the manner of a true and perfect new philosophy. So throughout Renaissance and early modern literature, Diotima fulfills many roles, but in every case, as far as I can tell, she's treated as a historical person, as real as Socrates. So what I've tried to do here today is start to rewrite the story of Diotima's reception, which is a project that spans from antiquity to the present day. Ficino represents a crucial point in the story, but not for the deleterious reasons attested in Waith's account, because on an account that continues to be cited in scholarship on this question. So it's thanks to his syncretic interpretive approach that the woman whom Socrates claims as his teacher was granted a fertile afterlife and was not simply dismissed as an absurdity in the history of philosophy. So he helped make possible the emergence of a legacy of new Diotimas, women who were at once friends, teachers, and philosophers in their own right. So thank you so much for listening to me speak about a subject I've been working on for maybe six years now. It's very dear to my heart. And I'm working on developing it to be published, I hope, somewhere. So I just thank you all and welcome all your questions, feedback. Thank you so much for taking the time to come listen. Oh, that's so cool. Thank you.